For once, it wasn't just him left feeling powerless. Captain Harris turned to his son, his expression softening for a moment. "You okay?" Jalen nodded, but his voice was flat when he answered, "Yeah, I guess." But deep down, he wasn't sure. Reed and Carter exchanged a glance. They had messed up. Badly. And the weight of it was finally sinking in. Captain Harris exhaled slowly, rubbing his jaw as if thinking. "Let me ask you something," he said, his voice quieter but no less firm. "If this had been someone else's son, someone without connections, without a father in uniform, how far would this have gone?" Neither officer answered. The silence was enough. Jalen scoffed, shaking his head. They weren't stopping any time soon. I could tell. Carter shifted uncomfortably. He wanted to argue, wanted to defend himself, but what could he say? That it wasn't personal. That they were just doing their job. Those excuses felt hollow now. Captain Harris let out a dry chuckle, but there was no humor in it. "I've been on this force for 20 years, he said, "and I've heard every excuse in the book. But right now, I'm not interested in excuses." The street was eerily quiet, the weight of the moment pressing down on all of them. "What I want to know," Harris continued, his voice cold now, "is what happens next." Carter and Reed didn't know, and that terrified them. The weight of Captain Harris's words hung in the air, thick with unspoken consequences. Reed and Carter stood frozen, every instinct telling them to speak, to explain, to justify, but there was nothing they could say that would make this moment disappear. The reality was staring them in the face. They had crossed a line, and now they had to answer for it. Jalen shifted, glancing between his father and the officers. A part of him wanted to walk away, to leave them to deal with whatever was coming. But another part, one that had been forced to stay silent too many times, wanted them to feel it, wanted them to understand, because this time it wasn't just going to be brushed off. The silence stretched too long. Captain Harris finally shook his head. "So that's it. Nothing to say." His voice was controlled, but there was an edge to it. A quiet rage simmering beneath his calm exterior. Reed cleared his throat, forcing himself to speak. "Sir, we weren't trying to harass him." He winced the moment the words left his mouth, knowing how weak they sounded. Jelen scoffed, folding his arms tighter. "So what do you call it, then?" Carter shifted on his feet. His face was pale now, beads of sweat forming at his temple. "We made a mistake," he admitted, voice low. "A bad one." Captain Harris stared at them, his jaw clenched. "A mistake." He let out a slow breath, shaking his head. "You know what's funny?" He paused, his expression unreadable. "I trained both of you. I trusted you." His voice hardened. "And yet, you still looked at my son and assumed he was a threat before you even knew his name." Neither officer could meet his eyes. Jalen finally spoke, his voice quiet but firm. "Would you have stopped me if I looked different?" The question sliced through the air like a blade. Carter's stomach twisted. Reed opened his mouth, but no words came out. Captain Harris took a slow step forward, the weight of his presence making the officers tense. "This job isn't about instincts alone," he said. "It's about judgment. And tonight, you proved yours can't be trusted." Reed and Carter felt the floor beneath them crumble. This wasn't just about a bad call. It was bigger than that. And they weren't sure if there was any way to fix it. The streetlights flickered above them, casting long shadows as Captain Harris took another slow step forward. His words still hung heavy in the air, but before either officer could respond, the distant sound of a car approaching broke the silence. A sleek black sedan rolled up to the curb, its tinted windows making it impossible to see inside. Jalen frowned, shifting uneasily. "Who's that?" he muttered under his breath. Captain Harris didn't answer. He was watching the vehicle carefully, his body suddenly tense. The doors unlocked with a quiet click, and after a brief pause, the back door swung open. A man in a dark suit stepped out, his face calm but unreadable. He adjusted his cuffs, then turned his sharp gaze toward the group. "Captain Harris," he said smoothly, nodding in acknowledgement. His voice was even, but there was something about him that sent a ripple of unease through the air. Reed and Carter exchanged quick glances, instinctively straightening. Whoever this was, he wasn't just some bystander. He had an air of authority, one that even Harris seemed to recognize. The captain's expression hardened. "This is department business," he said, his voice clipped. "I don't know who you are, but..." The streets were quiet, the night air thick with tension as two officers patrolled a well-off neighborhood. Officers Reed and Carter had been on the force for years, but tonight their instincts led them down the wrong path. As they cruised past a sleek black car parked near the sidewalk, their eyes locked onto a young black teen standing beside it, searching his pockets. Suspicion flared instantly. Without a second thought, they pulled over. "Hey, hands where we can see them," Officer Carter barked, stepping out of the squad car. The boy, startled, froze in place. His heart pounded in his chest. "What's the problem?" he asked, his voice steady but confused. Officer Reed exchanged a glance with his partner before stepping closer. "What are you doing in this neighborhood?" he asked, his tone sharp, loaded with assumption. The boy hesitated, glancing down at the expensive watch on his wrist, one he knew could be misinterpreted in the wrong hands. He took a breath. "I live here." But the officers weren't buying it. "Oh yeah, you got ID to prove that," Carter scoffed. The boy reached into his pocket, but before he could pull anything out, Reed grabbed his wrist. "Nice and slow," he warned. Tension crackled in the air as the officers pressed further, their voices firm, their words laced with doubt. The boy tried to explain, but every answer was met with skepticism. Frustration flickered in his eyes, but he knew better than to push back. Then, just as the situation was escalating, a sleek black SUV pulled up. The doors swung open, and out stepped a man whose presence made the officers stiffen. The boy exhaled, relief flooding his face. The man took one look at the scene unfolding before him, then fixed his sharp gaze on the officers. "What exactly," he asked in a dangerously calm voice, "do you think you're doing to my son?" In that moment, Reed and Carter felt the ground shift beneath them. The boy they had been interrogating was their boss's son, and the next 5 minutes would change everything. Officer Reed felt a cold chill creep up his spine. His grip loosened on the boy's wrist, and he quickly took a step back. Officer Carter, usually the louder of the two, was suddenly quiet. The man standing before them wasn't just anybody. He was their commanding officer, Captain Harris, and the boy, his son. The streetlights cast long shadows as Captain Harris slowly walked toward them, his eyes moving between his son and the two officers. His face was unreadable, but the weight of his presence was enough to make both officers shift uncomfortably. "I asked you a question," Captain Harris said, his voice still eerily calm. His son, standing beside him now, crossed his arms and looked away, frustration clear on his face. Reed cleared his throat, scrambling to find the right words. "Sir, we saw him standing by the car and thought it looked suspicious," he said, though his confidence was quickly unraveling. "Suspicious?" Captain Harris repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. His expression remained unreadable, but his eyes held something dangerous, something that made Carter's stomach tighten. Carter stepped in. "Sir, we didn't know." "Didn't know what?" Harris cut him off, his tone sharper now. "That he was my son, or that you were wrong to assume he didn't belong here in the first place." Neither officer spoke. The silence between them grew heavier, thick with realization. The boy, still tense, finally spoke. "They didn't even let me explain," he muttered, shaking his head. "Just grabbed me like I was doing something wrong." Captain Harris turned back to his officers, his gaze steady. "You two have been on my team for years. So tell me, is this how you do your job?" The weight of the question hung in the air. Neither officer had an answer. The truth was, they had made a snap judgment, a mistake that could cost them everything. The night suddenly felt colder, and in the next few minutes, they would learn just how deep the consequences ran. Carter swallowed hard, his pulse racing. He had been in tense situations before, but this was different. This wasn't a hostile suspect or a dangerous standoff. This was their own captain, looking at them like they were complete strangers. And maybe at this moment they were. Captain Harris kept his eyes on them, waiting for an answer neither officer could give. Reed opened his mouth, then closed it again. What could he say? That they had misjudged the situation. That they let their instincts take over without thinking. That wouldn't change the fact that they had humiliated the son of the one man in this department they couldn't afford to cross. The boy, Jalen, stood quietly beside his father, jaw tight, arms still crossed. His mind was racing just as fast as the officers. He had dealt with moments like this before, but it was different this time. Different because now there were consequences for them. The man raised a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. "Oh, I think you do." He reached into his pocket, pulling out a small leather badge. "Agent Collins, Internal Affairs." The words sent a jolt through Reed and Carter, their stomachs sinking instantly. Jalen's eyebrows lifted, caught off guard. Even Captain Harris hesitated for a split second before his expression darkened. Collins took a slow step forward, glancing between the officers. "I happened to be in the area when I got word of an incident involving 2 of your men." His gaze flickered to Jalen for a moment, as if already knowing exactly what had happened. "Figured I'd stop by and see it for myself." Reed felt a cold sweat break out at the back of his neck. Internal Affairs didn't just show up without reason. This wasn't just about what happened tonight. This was bigger. Collins turned back to Harris, his expression unreadable. "You trained them," he said casually. "You vouched for them. So I have to wonder." He paused, letting the words linger. How many times has something like this happened before? The accusation cut through the night like a blade. Carter's breath caught in his throat. Harris' jaw tightened. And Jalen? He just stared, waiting, because he already knew the answer. The air felt heavier now, thick with tension. Captain Harris' expression was unreadable, but his clenched jaw said everything. Reed and Carter stood stiff, their hearts pounding in their chests. Internal Affairs wasn't something you could talk your way out of. And Collins wasn't just here to observe, he was here for something more. Jalen shifted uncomfortably, looking at his father. "Dad." His voice was quieter now, hesitant. He could see the storm building behind his father's eyes. He knew this wasn't just about him anymore. Harris exhaled sharply, his hands tightening into fists before he forced himself to relax. "I don't answer to you, Collins," he said, his voice low. Collins smirked, as if he had been expecting that. "No, you don't," he agreed. "But you will answer to the department. And let's be honest, Captain, you've been around long enough to know how this works." He turned his attention back to Reed and Carter. "These 2, they're not the only problem. They're just the ones who got caught." Reed's stomach dropped. Carter's face drained of color. Harris' expression remained stone cold. But Jalen? He was watching everything closely now, his mind racing. Collins continued, stepping toward the officers. "So tell me," he said, tilting his head, "how many times have you let your so-called instincts lead you to the wrong conclusion? How many times have you stopped someone just like Jalen, convinced you were doing your job?" Neither officer spoke, because what could they say? That this was the first time. That it was an accident. The truth was, this wasn't about a single mistake. It was about a pattern. A pattern that, for the first time, had consequences. Captain Harris turned to his son, his face unreadable. "Go home, Jalen." Jalen's brows furrowed. "Dad." Now, his voice was firm, but Jalen could hear the exhaustion beneath it. Collins watched as Jalen hesitated, then reluctantly stepped toward the house, glancing back one last time before disappearing inside. The second he was gone, Harris turned back to Collins. "What do you really want?" Collins smiled, but it wasn't friendly. "It's not about what I want. It's about what happens next." He let the words settle before continuing. The department can't afford another scandal, and you know what that means. Harris didn't move, didn't blink, but deep down he knew. Reed and Carter, they were done. That much was obvious. Their careers, their reputations, gone in a matter of minutes. But the part no one saw coming, the final blow. Collins took a step closer, lowering his voice. And someone has to take responsibility. Harris finally spoke, his voice quieter now. You're saying they're not the only ones being investigated. Collins gave a small shrug. You trained them, Captain. His eyes locked onto Harris. That means they're mistakes. They're yours too. Silence. Pure, suffocating silence. For the first time, it wasn't just Reed and Carter whose futures hung in the balance. It was Captain Harris himself. The weight of Collins's words settled over them like a heavy fog. Captain Harris remained still, his expression unreadable, but inside, his mind was racing. He had spent decades building his career, enforcing discipline, shaping the officers under his command. But now he was being forced to question everything. If his men had he failed too? Reed and Carter stood frozen, their futures slipping through their fingers. Just minutes ago, they had been in control, making decisions without a second thought. Now, their careers, their reputations, everything were crumbling before them. There was no arguing their way out. The damage was done. Collins took a step back, checking his watch as if the conversation was just another part of his schedule. You'll be hearing from us soon, Captain, he said casually. I suggest you start thinking about how you're going to answer for this. Harris didn't respond. He didn't need to. Collins turned on his heel and headed back to his car. The door shut with a quiet click, and a moment later, the Satan disappeared down the street, leaving behind nothing but the echoes of what had just unfolded. Jalen stood by the front window watching. He had wanted the officers to face consequences, but now, seeing his father caught in the fallout, the victory felt hollow. He had always looked up to him, believed he was different. But now, he wondered, had his father ignored things like this before? Had he let moments like this slide? Outside, Harris let out a slow breath, then turned to Reed and Carter. They stood stiff, waiting for him to defend them, but he didn't. You made your choices, Harris said, his voice quiet but firm. And now you live with them. Neither officer spoke. There was nothing left to say. As Harris walked toward the house, Jalen stepped away from the window. Their eyes met for a brief second, and in that moment, Jalen saw something he hadn't seen before. Doubt. For the first time, his father wasn't sure where he stood, and that, more than anything, changed everything.